Labour has won a massive majority. It has routed the Tories, but it's not an unequivocal celebration because Keir Starmer's victory, extraordinary as it seems, is to a large extent built on sand. Labour has achieved a massive majority on a very small mandate. It hasn't been a great wave of popular acclaim for the new government so much as a wave of popular disgust with the old government. And one very clear indication of this is in Keir Starmer's own constituency, his vote halved. The Labour Party in 2024 actually got fewer votes than it did in 2019, and far fewer than it did in 2017. And that's despite the fact that a large part of the establishment swung behind the Labour Party this time, including some of the billionaire newspapers, whereas in 2019 and 2017 they were fiercely, viscerally opposed to the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party taking power. But Corbyn still got more votes than Starmer did. And I think what we're seeing is a widespread disillusionment with politics. This vast majority has been delivered on the lowest voter turnout for 20 years. And you can kind of see why, because there has been a great convergence among the major parties on major policy areas, particularly austerity. And that's the great danger of centrist politics, of a failure to take the bold measures which are required to mend this country. Because if you don't, people give up on politics as usual. And they do one of two things. They either withdraw completely and don't even go and vote, or they will be seduced by people who say, well, we're completely different. We're the anti-politics. We too say to hell with all of them, and we're going to give you something completely new in the form of the far right. And this has been a big part of the appeal for reform. I think there's no future at all in centrism. I think that the idea that you can somehow appease the Rupert Murdochs of this world and at the same time deliver what the country needs has been busted. Starmer has kind of offered that as a package, but I don't think it's going to be sustainable any more than it's been sustainable elsewhere in Europe, where centrist governments have been falling like flies. You can't reconcile those two demands. You can't reconcile the appeasement of oligarchic power with the delivery of what the entire population needs to lead a decent life. Where governments have tried to do that, they hit the rocks pretty damn quickly. Going along with the Rupert Murdoch agenda, the oligarch agenda of cutting public services, of not taxing the rich anymore, might feel like an easy route to power. It might feel like cutting a corner so that you can get into power more easily or maintain power more easily if you are a formally progressive party. But in the longer term, you are destroying your power base because you create mass disillusionment among the people who would otherwise be voting for you. And we saw that under New Labour in this country, that people just started pulling away from politics when they saw that New Labour was tearing up the principles for which they thought they had voted. Everything from the Private Finance Initiative to the Iraq War. We've seen the same across Europe. In France, where people have turned away from Macron centrism because it has not delivered. It has not produced the much fairer social settlement that many people would look to from progressive politics. And what happens in all these cases is that the far right steps into the breach. And in order to push back against the rising power of the far right, which rises in response to the political failures of centrism, we need a much bolder left-wing politics. And one of the striking features about Jeremy Corbyn's politics is that the policies themselves were very popular. When people were polled on the policies in the manifesto that Corbyn put forward in 2019, but they weren't told where those policies had come from, they were very enthusiastic about the policies. And those policies would have preserved us from some of the horrors of Tory rule, but could also potentially have preserved a Labour Party from the danger of implosion, which comes about by trying to please both the bosses and the workers at the same time. One of the extraordinary standout successes of this election has been the Green Party, which went from 1 seat to 4, including seats which it seemed really unlikely that they were going to win. And what's very interesting about this is that they had that radical, progressive programme that you would look for from the Labour Party, not just on environmental issues, but on a whole host of issues, including Gaza, which Labour has been particularly bad on and has lost a lot of votes over. Green Party is very strong on Gaza, very strong on social justice, very strong on robust, publicly owned public services, on so many of the things that you might want to see from a Labour government. The Green Party has stepped into that policy void. But strikingly, it's had only a tiny fraction of the coverage that reform has been given. The BBC and the rest of the media are absolutely fixated by Nigel Farage, as they have been with all the killer clowns, people like Boris Johnson. They love them. Their box office, you can easily clip little bits of them and stick them on social media and they'll go viral. The more outrageous, the more disgraceful, the more shameful the things they say and do are, the more copy you're going to get and the more audience you're going to get. But also, I suspect that within the BBC, there are quite a few people who would actually want to see them win. Quite a few people who genuinely support Farage, because otherwise it's pretty incomprehensible just how much he's been built up by the BBC in particular. In fact, without the BBC, which Farage professes to hate, Farage would be nowhere. He's been created out of whole cloth by that organisation. And he's a very dangerous character because he can mobilise people, not against the problems that we face as a country, but against scapegoats, against distractions from those problems. He can say they are the real problem. They are what's preventing you from having decent housing and decent healthcare and decent schools and a decent society. But it's a tremendous distraction from the real sources of harm to this nation, which has really been ripping us apart, which is oligarchic capital. One of the striking features of the past 2 general elections in the United Kingdom is that there is no such thing as a safe seat anymore. Everything is up for grabs. And that can be a very hazardous thing, or it can be a very hopeful thing. We could see the far right seizing seats where they previously had no hope at all, because the far right now is dangerously resurgent. Or we could see far more progressive left-wing forces getting a foothold in politics which they didn't have before, being able to take seats which weren't available before. Everything is up for grabs, and it's up to us whether we put ourselves in a position where we can grab these opportunities. We do need a different system. First past the post is fundamentally corrupt and wrong. We need a form of proportional representation which will give us a far more representative politics than we have at the moment. And I'm fully aware that that can let in some very unsavoury parties, particularly the Reform Party. But that is the cost of this thing we call democracy. If we are to believe that our votes should count, and if we are to believe that those votes should influence the composition of Parliament in this very weak and thin form of this thing we call democracy that we practice in this country, then that has to be allocated fairly, even if we don't like the results of that fairness. One of the tragedies of our first past the post system is that it has effectively forced 2 parties into one. The right wing of the Labour Party and the left wing of the Labour Party are completely different beasts. And currently Keir Starmer is celebrating killing the Labour left. He has not killed the Labour left. The Labour left is still there. There's still a massive demand in this country for politics which are to the left of Keir Starmer, a demand which is being frustrated and a demand which Keir Starmer absolutely refuses to meet. And so what he's going to see is a resurgence of the left. Perhaps as the Labour left, but perhaps it will now take a different form. We don't know, because there's going to be a lot of left-wing people within the Labour Party who see that there's no future for them there, and so they might back alternative parties, they might even create a new party. But that headache for Keir Starmer is not going to go away because the need for more radical policies has not gone away. Obviously, the most alarming aspect of this election has been the big vote for reform. That big vote is something we should be very concerned about. It's not at all inconceivable that Reform and the Conservatives form some kind of alliance with Nigel Farage in charge. So let's not be too quick to dance on the grave of the Conservatives, because zombie-like they will, in one form or another, re-emerge. They always do. They are the kind of default government of this country. Why? Because power is behind them. Economic power supports the Conservatives because the Conservatives give it what it wants. And so anyone trying to push a progressive agenda is always going to be pushing that boulder up the hill. It's really tough because you've got everyone pushing against you. You've got the whole force of gravity of economic power trying to stop you from getting that boulder up the hill. But when the Conservatives want to get into power, well, all they have to do is take the chocks away and the boulder rolls back down the hill. It's so much easier to get into power as a Conservative government than it is as a progressive government in this country. And so we should never underestimate the capacity of the Conservatives to rebuild, to reinvent themselves, to find a new form in which to govern. They've done it successfully many times before. We should be glad we got an interlude. We can breathe a bit of a sigh of relief, but it's by no means the end of the battle. Politics never stops. The only way that we can ever get a fair and decent society is through constant struggle. The constant struggle against economic power, against inordinate political power, against undemocratic forces. You have to fight that every day. You can't relax. You can't just let politics take its course and imagine that good things happen. Good things do not happen by accident. There's plenty of bad things happen by accident, but good things have to be struggled for step by step. It's an endless battle to create a better country. Regardless of who's in government, Double Down News exists to hold power to account. That's what journalism is supposed to do, but sadly, so seldom does. So please support Double Down News by becoming a patron on Patreon.